Alright guys, this is the Period 3 content review for the 2014-15 Connerland APUSH review. In this period we'll be covering the years 1754 to 1800. Alright, so the first thing we're going to talk about as a component of the Road to Revolution, which is kind of the main focus of the first part of this review, is going to be the French and Indian War. Now you might also see this referred to as the 7 Years' War if you see it on the exam. And like all the wars that we've talked about this year, you don't need to know every single battle and every single key component. You just kind of need to know certain things. Normally it's going to be what caused the war, the turning point, and what came about because of it. But for this one, we're going to focus more on what came about because of it. And there's a couple of things that come out of this. Number one, as a result of the treaty at the end of this war, France is basically kicked out of North America. Okay, so Great Britain picks up all the land that was previously held by the French government. Also, as a cause of Britain having to pay for this war, they began to try to raise money to pay off their debts that they had accrued because of this war. And the way that they go about doing this is to impose what are called revenue taxes on the colonists. Now, as we go forward here, you're going to see there's a lot of backlash to taxes. And that's because the colonists are really seeing themselves as still being British. And because of that, they don't believe that they should be taxed for revenue purposes because they don't do that in the British Crown. So really the bottom line on it is this is one of the first times that Britain actually treats America like, or the colonies, actually treats them like a colony, and the backlash that you see comes from that. Our next event on the Road to Revolution is the Proclamation of 1763, and there's a couple of things that play into this line being drawn. And first of all, I guess I should say the line that was drawn by the Proclamation of 1763 is basically, as you can see on this map, is a line from north to south, pretty much along the line of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, the reason the British passed this was because due to colonists trying to go west and pick up inexpensive land, and population pressures that were coming from migration, there were a lot of people streaming across the Appalachians trying to pick up land and coming into conflict with natives. And British Crown felt like that was a problem that didn't necessarily have to happen. So what they're basically trying to do with this thing is they're trying to force colonists to stay east of the Appalachian Mountains. Now the result of this, which is probably the most important, is that the colonists just pretty much ignored it and did what they wanted to. But this is yet another event on the line of restrictions and laws that the British Crown is putting on colonists that they hadn't done in previous periods. Alright, so our next event on the Road to Revolution is the Stamp Act in 1765. Now, to be honest with you guys, this is a big one. This is where the types of protests and the way that colonists protest begins to change. Okay, it goes in more of a violent, abrasive way than it has for acts that have been passed previously. So, as far as the bottom line on it, the Stamp Act was passed once again in 1765 for the simple purpose of raising revenue by British troops. Now, as they do this, as they begin to put this tax into effect, there's a couple of issues that colonists raise in regards to whether Britain can do this. Number one is strictly, does Parliament have a right to tax the colonists? Well, from the colonists' point of view, they felt that they didn't. And from the British point of view, they felt that absolutely they had a right to do this because, remember, at this point, the land mass of America is still a British colony, just like anywhere else in the world. Now, they had gotten more rights and more privileges due to the fact that the people that lived there were British, but you know, at the end of the day, they're still kind of subservient to the crown. And the second issue was, can members of Parliament truly reflect colonial interest when there are no representatives from the colonies in Parliament? And from the colonists' point of view, once again, the answer was no. And from the British point of view, it was absolutely, because according to them, the colonists were represented through a process or a term called virtual representation, which meant that even though they didn't physically have anybody in Parliament representing them, the British Parliament looked out for them in ways that they didn't other people. So what ends up happening out of this, to shorten it down, is a huge debate follows in the colonies, and what they determine is that Britain can in fact not tax them. They say no taxation without representation, which is what we just talked about. So they go into a series of protests against the Stamp Act. This is where the burning tax collectors in effigy, tarring and feathering, boycotts was a big one that we talked about in class, as far as Massachusetts Bay and other colonies in the Northeast refuse to import any British goods. They boycott anything coming from Britain. And what happens is it hurts British manufacturing and warehousing and shipping to the point where they begin to raise or bring pressure on members of Parliament till the Stamp Act is eventually repealed. And that's the bottom line on what happened with it. Colonial pressure leads to it being repealed. Next on the list is the Coercive Acts. By the way, I hope it wasn't too distracting. I'm pretty sure you heard my dog barking in the last slide, so we had to take care of that for a second. But the Coercive Acts. Okay, now we're hitting the high points of everything, and you got to realize there's kind of an order to this. Okay, you have the Stamp Act, and things kind of settle down for a little bit, and then you have the Boston Tea Party. And once again, the Boston Tea Party. Colonial protesters dumped tons of tea into the Massachusetts Bay in protest of, attacks. Just in protest to a lot of things. Bottom line on it is that in response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passes the Coercive Acts, which was designed strictly to punish Boston and to punish the Massachusetts Bay Colony for the actions of those few who dumped that tea. There are several components to this. You can look at it in the review book, but the main one is the port of Boston becomes closed. So basically, there's no shipborne or seaborne traffic in or out of Boston Harbor, and there's devastating economic effects that happen because of that. And they're doing it to send a message to the rest of the colonies as well as Massachusetts Bay that dissent and protest such as what they did will not be tolerated. All right, next on the list is Common Sense, which is a pamphlet written by a guy named Thomas Paine, in which he comes out with a strongly worded call for independence. Now, there's a couple of characteristics of this you need to be aware of. Number one, Paine was a very serious advocate of what's called Republican government, which is basically what we have now. Because of this, he was opposed to monarchies in general, and in particular, he was opposed to the monarchy and the actions of the monarchy in Britain. So when he comes out and he talks about this, he uses a couple philosophies with it. And one of the main arguments that stuck with people was the fact that as he was making these arguments, he looked to nature, which is what a lot of people did with the Enlightenment and other stuff during this time period. And what he says is that if you look around at nature and you look around at the world, there is no place where the little rules the big, where the little controls the big. And what he's doing is he's applying that to the fact that Britain is a very tiny island, and it doesn't make sense in the natural order for a tiny island like them to be able to control a very large landmass like North America is. And he says it just doesn't make sense. So for that reason, plus the fact that monarchy is wrong, we should rebel, we should declare our independence from Britain. And what it did is it really turned the tide for the independence movement. It brought a lot of people into it that hadn't been in it up to that point. All right, next on the list is the Declaration of Independence in 1776. I would first of all be very aware of this as a turning point of the revolutionary movement, because after we send this thing to King George, there really is no turning back, okay? Because the Declaration of Independence is what it says, and it's also a list of grievances and wrongdoings that the colonists were accusing King George of doing. I would also be able to tie in the Enlightenment influence on the Declaration of Independence, particularly the words of a man named John Locke, where it's basically talking about the philosophy of natural rights. And you see that reflected in the Declaration of Independence with the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It also talked about the rights of oppressed people and the ability of a group of people to abolish or alter their government if it wasn't living up to the responsibilities it had to the people. And in the eyes of a lot of the founding fathers and the writers of the contributors to the Declaration of Independence, sorry about that, King George and the British government was not living up to the responsibilities that were set by it, that are given to it by the people. All right, so we've declared our independence. Now it's time for the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Now you basically have two sides break out. Like anything else, you're going to have people who support the war and people that are against it. As far as the reasons that colonists supported the war, number one, it all boils down to tyranny. It's the fact that they don't feel like England is representing their interests. They feel like there's some abuses and injustices and all kinds of stuff. They believe that there's a lot of corruption in the British government as well, particularly with tax collection and things like that. They also want, going back to the colonist objection to virtual representation, they also wanted someone to physically represent their interest in Parliament. They wanted to have a voice in England, and they didn't have that. Also, they wanted to preserve their local autonomy. There had been colonial governments since the beginning of colonial expansion, with the House of Burgesses in Virginia and other examples like that. So, like it says on the thing, it boils down to tyranny, parliamentary control, and greater control of their own affairs, both political, economic, social, what have you. As far as the Revolutionary War, once again, you don't have to know every single component of it, but you need to know the turning point, the battle that switches the momentum of the war. And the one that does it in the Revolutionary War is the Battle of Saratoga, and the reason for that is simply this battle is what convinces France to jump in with us. France had a long-standing rivalry in a series of wars with Britain, and they're really looking for any reason to get in and oppose Britain. They just need to know they'll be on the winning side. And after Saratoga, they kind of feel like there's a good possibility that's going to happen. So with the alliance, they provide some military training and leadership at Lafayette, and also supplies and support and things like that. So at the end of the Revolutionary War, after the Battle of Yorktown, everybody gets together to sign a treaty, and the Treaty of Paris are the peace terms that come out of the Revolutionary War in 1783. Now, as far as the components of it, you need to be aware of a couple of them. Number one, it basically sets America's new boundaries, and the fact that the British, except for some forts in what we now consider to be the Midwest, are basically kicked out of the country. We pick up our original land and any lands that were controlled by the British. Also, as a concession to the British government, everybody gives and takes a little bit in most treaties. Loyalists are not going to be prosecuted because of prosecuted and persecuted, I guess you could say, as a result of them supporting the British Crown during the Revolution. And then Britain was supposed to give up trading forts in the West, as it was called back then, as I said earlier, but in fact they didn't. So one of the tie-ins between the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 is going to be the British not doing what they were supposed to with the Treaty of Paris in regards to giving up these forts. All right, so we've won the Revolutionary War. Now what? We got to figure out how we're going to govern these states. And a group of delegates get together and they draft the first governing document of what is now known as the United States, and it's going to be the Articles of Confederation. Now, for our purposes, the big point is going to be the weaknesses of the AOC, or Articles, however you want to refer to them. And the big one's going to be there's really no central or federal authority. There's no executive branch, so there's no president. There's no judicial branch, so there's no Supreme Court. There's really nothing to tie all these states together that are now, a part of a United Nations, I guess. United States, I guess, is the best way to put it. Also, some of the weaknesses, there's the lack of an authority to tax different states, so there's no way to regulate interstate commerce. And there's also really no way to keep these guys from going off on their own page. So these weaknesses are going to become exposed here in a second, and people are going to realize that we need more of a federal government, more of a central power, and that directly goes against what people were trying to do with the Articles, because the one thing we did not want to do after we won the Revolutionary War was to slide back into tyranny. We didn't want to live under a king. So, from the good side, the Articles of Confederation is a direct step in the direction away from that, and the fact that they were looking to not slip back into tyranny, but it went a little bit too far. Okay, the bottom line on it, there was no way for the states to be brought together as a unified group of entities. So the event that really exposes the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation is Shays Rebellion. Now, as far as this goes, you need to know the causes and consequences. And the causes are pretty simple. A lot of farmers in Massachusetts are losing their farms because they can't pay their debt. So what happens is one of two things. Well, one and two things, I guess is the best way to put it. If you can't pay off your debt, they're going to foreclose on your farm, and they're going to use that to get the money back. And they're also, in a lot of cases, going to put these debtors or put these farmers in jail for not paying their debt. So Shays Rebellion gets going by a guy named Daniel Shays as a form of protest and a way to try to get reforms to solve some of these problems. Okay, so it all boils down to economic frustrations on the parts of farmers. So this little rebellion, which is not very long-lived, and I guess it's not a blip on the map, but it's not a major event. It's really major because it exposes the weaknesses of the Articles and the fact that if this things begin to happen again, there's really no way for the federal government, or lack thereof, to go in and control this stuff. And people begin to fear what is called control by mobocracy. In other words, people getting together and rebelling for whatever reason, and there's no way to control it. So people begin to question whether the Articles of Confederation is the appropriate document to govern these states. And they realize we need a stronger federal government, or a stronger central government, and then we move forward to try to amend the Articles of Confederation.